There's loads of great stuff in this episode, but listen, before we get going, I would love it if you could subscribe, but as well as that, just hit the notification bell as well, because as soon as there's a new episode or something fresh from all of us, you will get it first. But for now, grab a pen and paper, because I think you might need to make some notes on this episode. It's full of brilliant takeaways. Enjoy. Here we go.
Hi there, I'm Jake Humphrey and you're listening to High Performance, the podcast that delves into the minds of some of the most successful athletes, visionaries, entrepreneurs and artists on the planet and aims to unlock the secrets of their success for you. Now, everyone needs a professor in their life, and mine is also an author and an expert in the success of sporting cultures, Damien Hughes. And Damien, look, as a football fan, I know you're excited about this, but also as someone who enjoys seeing a person have success through periods of adversity. It makes this an interesting conversation we've got lined up today.
Absolutely, Jake. I think one of the key themes we often touch on the series is the theme of grit, resilience, the ability to keep going even when times are tough. And today's guest is somebody I'm really keen to explore that topic with.
Yep, we all have them. We all have to get through them. So how do you overcome those difficult times? Let's welcome a footballer who had to overcome the challenge of living in a homeless shelter as a youngster. He then had to process being released by Southampton as a teenager, thinking his pro career might be over. He then had to fight after over a year out injured at Bournemouth. He then had to retain his composure after his England debut was marred by racist abuse in Bulgaria. So what have those challenges taught him that you can learn from? How do we try and remember that our reaction to the things that happen to us is always more important than the things themselves? Get ready to take the learnings from the life of a professional footballer and use them to better your life. Welcome to the High Performance Podcast, England and Aston Villa defender Tyrone Mings. Nice to have you with us.
Nice to be here. Thank you. What a great intro. Thank you.
Right, well, let's keep it up then. What is, no pressure, what is high performance to you, Ty?
Good question. And yeah, of course, it's different to everybody. It really is. And high performance, I think, is probably a byproduct of what goes on between my ears, and which is why I'm really interested to speak to this man here about psychology and sports psychology, because I think I genuinely believe that high performance, when you get to the level that I'm currently operating at, is such fine margins, and it is such fine tuning of everything that we've learned. Physically, I know that I can go into a game and play 90 minutes, but what can I be doing away from the pitch? And what information can I be taking in to help what's going on and what's being processed between the ears and in the mind, to give me a bit of an advantage, because there are better technical players out there than me. There are better athletes out there than me. But high performance, I truly believe, is in the mind, and mental preparation is something that I'm quite big on. Mental preparation is something that I think is often overlooked. Because when you get to the Premier League or when you get to international football, everybody is physically prepared. Everybody is in good shape. You're not coming up against people that are unfit or slow, really. So high performance, I think, is a matter of small margins.
Well, you're talking to the right man with Damien Hughes sitting alongside me, because Damien, quite often people, when they talk about elite level sport and performance, which is where Tyrone operates, is they talk about the big stuff. But what Ty has already mentioned is the focus on the very small things that will lead you to the big thing.
Yeah, and I think that this is one of the areas I was really keen to explore with you, Tyrone, because when we were preparing for this, I looked at some of the footage of you when you first came through at Ipswich, and then you're now playing Aston Villa, and physically there wasn't a huge difference in terms of your size and the shape that you're in. But I'm intrigued by the mental leap that you've had to make. You know, it was almost like going from being a middle manager to being on the board of a big organisation, that step up. What have you noticed the big difference between when you first started to where you are now?
Probably the intensity of the game. I think from Championship to the Premier League, and I experienced it even when I dropped down to the Championship from Bournemouth and went to Aston Villa. Probably realised that there's a few things you can get away with in the Championship, a few mistakes you can make that don't ultimately lead to either a goal going in or high level of criticism. So the Championship, I think, is a physically very demanding in terms of the games that you have to play. But mentally, I think in the Premier League, you know that not only the scrutiny is higher and more intense, but also the players are much more, they're the best in the world, really, in terms of the players that we've got in the Premier League. So I think the concentration that comes with that is draining. You come off the pitch and physically you might not have done as much as you've done in the Championship. You might not have been involved in as many aerial duels or physical battles, but mentally you're just drained. And that's something I don't think you can ever prepare for either. I don't think you can explain to someone how tough the Premier League is. And especially when you're a defender. I mean, defenders are never the ones to get substituted in the 70th minute, are they? They're the ones that attackers are coming on and they're fresh and they're bright and you have to go again. So that's probably the biggest step up. Like you said, physically, it's not that much difference in terms of the distance that you cover, maybe the high speed intensity that you do in a game. But the concentration is very intense, of course.
And if you were going to compare it to like when you played non-league football, like what was the big difference between non-league and Championship?
Well, I found that not too bad, and that sounds really strange. I mean, the jump I made was something like 9 leagues or something like that in the space of, well, overnight really. In the space of 7 days, I played for Chippenham on one Saturday, and the following Saturday I was at Ellen Road in the first team squad. So, I mean, physically, I always felt like I was doing the same things in non-league as what Mick McCarthy was asking me to do at Ipswich. Be a good defender, be a man. I mean, that taught me a lot. Obviously, from being in non-league, you have to grow up quite quickly in terms of your physical ability to cope with strong, real physical men. And I was 18 at the time, 17, 18, 19. So I had to grow up quickly. And jumping from non-league to the Championship, it didn't seem like I was doing that much different. Now, I was real fortunate that I was afforded a period where I could develop mentally and I could get used to the demands of the Championship, and I guess obviously the physical demands were increased, and I had to get used to not just training on a Tuesday and Thursday evening. I had to get used to training every day and being good every day and being in peak performance every day. And then not only that, I had to be in shape to go and compete or be ready to go on the Saturday, because pretty much straight away I was on the bench every week. And I was thinking, if he brings me on here, I'm not too sure I'm ready. So I was afforded a period of 6 months before I made my debut, and that probably allowed that period of adjustment to happen a little bit more naturally than if I'd just been thrown in at the deep end.
Yeah.
See, I'm really interested in how you psychologically compare the different levels at which you've competed, because I think physically, like, you're born with natural ability. You can work harder in the gym. You work with better players and better managers. It improves you physically, but that doesn't mean that you're psychologically ready for a step up. Like, how do you go from being released by Southampton thinking your professional career is over to being a part-time footballer and what were you, a mortgage advisor, to a few days,
good one as well.
I bet, to a few days later being on the bench for Ipswich Town? Psychologically, I'm just fascinated how you cope with that. Were there doubts? If there were, how did you deal with them? Or maybe you're not the kind of guy that has them.
No, I mean, I think I would be. I don't think anyone would believe me if I said that I wasn't the sort of person to have them. I think they're natural emotions to have and natural thoughts to have, and I think they're things that you should learn from as well. And I mean, the difference, I guess, was, and the time when I processed it. I mean, I didn't have time to process it for a start. Like you said, everything happened in the early years of my professional career so quickly. I didn't have time.
Is that a good thing then, maybe?
Yeah, I think so. I was just caught up in this whirlwind of positive emotions that I signed my first professional contract. I was now a professional footballer. Like, everything that I'd wanted to happen. And ironically, I was meant to make my debut in the FA Cup in the January, and I only signed in late November, I think. I was meant to make my debut in the January in the FA Cup against Aston Villa, and they were in the Premier League at the time. Wow, this is everything I've worked for. It's going to be at a packed Villa Park. And I had to tell Mick McCarthy then that I'd already played in the FA Cup for Yate Town, it was, against Winchester in like August. So I couldn't play, no. And so then I had to wait until the second to last game of the season, maybe the last game of the season against Burnley, to make my debut. And like I said, all of these things were positive. And then from there, I was happy to play understudy to Aaron Cresswell.
Just because they're positive doesn't mean they're not scary.
No, definitely scary. I mean, going into the dressing room or first team environment with seasoned pros was scary. Of course, people like DJ Campbell, Michael Chopra, Danny Higginbottom, who was at Southampton when I was in the academy. Like, there were people that, of course, I knew about, watched for years, and it was tough. And one of the topics that I wanted to explore, like I said to you on the phone, was the idea around the inferiority complex. How do you overcome that? Because everybody must face that, whether you're a presenter, whether you're a footballer. Everybody must face the situation where they don't quite feel that they're ready to step into what they're about to step into.
Still have it today?
Absolutely. Yeah.
See, because that intrigues me about you, Tyrone, that you're a guy that I was going to ask you the question about how do you walk into a dressing room and fit in and yet still retain your own identity to be able to stand out?
It's difficult. It absolutely is. And I think some of the great things we're seeing about social media, one of the pros about social media, is that you can be your own person. So when you're walking into a dressing room, quite often you can tell a lot about a person by their Instagram, or you can find out a lot about someone and what they're interested in, what their characteristics are, and kind of what makes them tick by what they're posting on social media. So I guess you're not walking into dressing rooms as blind as perhaps you were a few years back, but it's not easy at all. Of course not.
But when you were a kid going into the Ipswich dressing room for the first time, where they didn't know about who you were or they weren't following you on social media, how did you sort of go in there and still be the guy that had dealt with adversity of being let go at Southampton, the guy with the perspective of what the real world had to offer you?
I guess you just have to park it. Everything that I was doing last week as a mortgage advisor, nobody really cared in the Ipswich training room. Of course, it's a nice story. It's nice to hear, wow, you've done this. But people were still like I was in the under-23s dressing room, so that kind of helped because I could get used to being around people my age and wasn't necessarily under the banter or scrutiny of being in a dressing room with seasoned pros. But I was training with them and I was traveling with them and I was still very much the apprentice. But I thrived in that situation. I thrived on being the underdog or someone who wasn't meant to succeed or someone that wasn't meant to come in and be the first choice left back or then go on to be the club's record sale. I thrive on opportunities like that because Mick McCarthy quite rightly said when he gave me the contract, that if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. There's no skin off the club's nose. It was no financial burden to give me a contract. I think I was earning less at my first deal at Ipswich than I was as a mortgage advisor. So it wasn't rags to riches story. It was just an opportunity, and that's what I see it as.
But when you go into a dressing room like that, though, where it's easy to be distracted by the Rolex watches or the flash cars in the car park or the designer clothes that people are wearing, how do you sort of see through that kind of surface level nonsense in many ways to see more about who are the characters I should be listening to, who are the ones that I need to almost tune out from?
I found that as a long evolving process and one that I'm still getting used to now, who I enjoy being around. I don't think that ever changes because your needs as a person and your interests as a person can quite rightly change over time. So at the time, I wasn't necessarily going to go in there and think, I was a mortgage advisor. I wonder if anybody here is interested in talking about finance.
Probably not.
Exactly. So I was just naturally drawn to people my age. There was nobody with similar experiences. So I was just drawn to people my age. And I think the higher you go, ironically, the probably harder it is to navigate your way through that. Because like I said, I went in there with no expectation on me and no expectation of other people. So they didn't expect anything from me. I didn't expect that one day I'd be living comfortably and earning great money. And I was just there for what it was, and I took it for what it was, which was an opportunity. It wasn't necessarily going to lead to anything more at that time because I only had a 18-month contract and I wasn't in a position where I could relate to any of the things that everybody else had in the dressing room.
So that shift then, if you think of it in terms of expectation, that at those days you're walking in there and there's no expectation, or the only expectation is a hope that you might do well. Now you walk into the Aston Villa dressing room and there's an expectation that you have to do well. So it shifts from hoping to having to do it. When did you realise that the dial had shifted it?
Probably when I went to Aston Villa, if I'm brutally honest, because like I said, only around my knee injury was I able to take stock of everything that had happened in that journey so far. So from signing pro to making my debut to moving to Bournemouth, only when I got injured, I was able to take a step back and be relieved of all of that pressure and relieved of what's happening next Saturday, or I need to do this to be in shape for the game. I could only then take stock of my life and what it had become. That's also a scary process and scary thought to have. But I guess the expectation is something that elite players have to deal with, and people at the top have to deal with, and I guess you be careful what you wish for. You want to be at the top, but you can't be removed from any expectation or scrutiny. So I guess when I went to Aston Villa, I was the Premier League player that was coming to help Aston Villa try and get promoted. At that point, I felt some expectation on my shoulders. But when I was at Bournemouth, I was very much a bit part player. So I came in, if someone was injured, I knew I wouldn't stay in the team because the settled back four was what it was. And it had to take an injury or a suspension for me to get an opportunity. So there was no expectation when I played then really either. It was go in, play well.
So what was the difference when you walked in there and you recognised that sense of expectation? What did you do to make adjustments to be able to cope with that?
First of all, I had to appreciate my stature in the dressing room. So I had to realise that how I'm living and how I'm perceived around the place, there's going to be probably younger players or even more senior players that are going to take my lead probably on how I am and what I do. And that's a responsibility, I guess, as well as an expectation. And when you get to that stage, you have to either grow into that role or lead people astray by not
Maybe
doing
it's
the
a
right
bit of a
things.
mental reset, isn't it?
I think it's just a constant evolution.
Yeah.
And your role in the dressing room always changes. And that's something that being, I guess, emotionally aware of other people and how your actions might affect them is something that is probably a leadership trait. And you have to be aware of how you may influence another player's career. Because I would have loved nothing more than to go into an Ipswich dressing room, everybody huddle around me and say, if everything's going to be fine and we're going to help you through it. But that's not what happens in football. You just have to find your own way, and you have to recognise who are the positive influences in the dressing room and perhaps who are the negative ones.
See, Carlo Ancelotti speaks around this quite powerfully. He speaks about in any dressing room there will be alphas, like the leaders emerge, and he talks about there's two criteria, technical or social. So they're either the best players and everyone looks up to them, or they're the larger-than-life characters that when they speak, everybody listens to them. But he says that holy grail is when you can get the best players and the social leaders that are leading in the right way, that are setting the right example.
I think that's a really interesting point that Ancelotti makes, because if you can strike a balance of one of the best players in the team and also someone who is a leader off the pitch, I think you've got a special player.
So if you had like a combination in many ways of, like, I know Barcelona talk about, you have the guy that's the visionary, the Jack example, the guy that is the backbone, the guy that's just solid and keeps everything done. And then they have another phrase that they call it the Dr. No. So the cynic amongst that leadership group, the one that stops you getting carried away with expectations. Which of those three roles do you think you play?
I mean, probably the cynic. I would love to say the backbone, but I think for me to be that, I have to constantly deliver solid performances on the pitch. And now I'm only 8 games into my second season in the Premier League as a regular player, and I think I'm still developing that. I'm still developing a level of consistency that not only you find on the pitch, also you find off the pitch, finding what works for you throughout the week, what works for you before games, because obviously we're living in a world right now where things are changing so quickly, and you have to be dynamic enough, not just in your thinking, but also in how you prepare for games. I mean, going away with England before the Premier League even starts is something you wouldn't have been able to think was going to happen a couple of years ago. But we're living in such strange times that I think being able to change is such a powerful thing. And I think I'm probably more of a cynic in terms of being able to see things with more perspective than not only just in Aston Villa dressing room and bubble, but also in the real world. So when we're talking about wage deferrals and stuff like that with the CEO, we're sitting there as a group saying, no, not having our money. What do you mean? We got to do this, we got to do that. And whilst all of those things are true, because whilst you're saying, okay, we're going to defer some money, but then what, you're going to go spend another 100 million in the summer? That don't make sense. Then I'm thinking about it from the CEO's role. I'm thinking, well, we've got to show a little bit of empathy towards him because he's ultimately in a difficult situation. The club are losing money, the fans aren't allowed. So I think I probably am unable to see things from a slightly different perspective at times. But I'm definitely not the visionary.
What's interesting here is that we see this a lot from high achieving people that come and talk to us on the podcast, is that if you broke your life down into the small moments, you can see all of the sort of shitty things that have happened, whether it's the difficulty of living in a homeless shelter as a young lad, whether it is being released just as you thought you were going to make it as a professional footballer, whether it's having an injury at Bournemouth that really sent you into a downward spiral. Yet all of those things mean that when the time comes for you to need to be a leader in the Premier League, the fact that you're 27 and you're now establishing yourself as an England international, not 17, is actually really helpful, isn't it?
Oh, honestly, I wouldn't change it for the world. I wouldn't change anything that I've been through. And I know that hindsight's a wonderful thing. If my career had gone in a different path, certainly I would have changed things. I would say, if only I didn't get injured, I would have made it. But I look at my journey and the things that I've been through and the experiences that I've lived and the amount of, I guess, experiences that I can lean on and pull on, the wisdom that I can gain from those situations. It's not a thing that I would change. I mean, I look at people that come through the academy, and obviously no journey is the same, and no route to the Premier League or England, whatever you perceive as success, no route is right or wrong. But I look at which I would choose from being an all-round better human point of view. I think I've seen so many things that when the dreaded time of retirement comes, that so many people are afraid of, is something I'll be able to embrace, and I know what's coming. I know what life is like on the other side.
And I've seen the amazing things you do, whether it's feeding the homeless. I see you going on social media every time you change your squad number, and you offer to buy a new shirt with a new squad number for anyone that's got the old squad number.
Yeah, that was a lot more expensive at Aston Villa than it was at Ipswich. I think at Ipswich was only about 5 people, but
quite a few at Villa.
Yeah,
it means you've got a lot of fans. It's not a bad thing. Whether it's buying tickets for fans who can't afford tickets, I wonder whether all of these things that you do, you can trace right the way back to when you had that period living in a homeless shelter, living a life not of plenty.
Absolutely. And I think, like I said, I've seen what it's like to be a football fan or to be someone that needs help or needs a leg up in life. And I mean, whilst I can't dedicate my whole life to helping other people, we're certainly in a position where we can help, whether it be financially or obviously we're quite restricted time-wise in things that we can get involved in and can't. But certainly we can help financially. We can help by showing a little bit of empathy. We can help by understanding that everybody isn't in quite as fortunate positions as us. But then I look at my situation, of course, as a kid and growing up, and I was showered by love. I mean, I wasn't in a situation where I felt unloved or alone. My mum made some unsavory situations great as a kid. So at the time, I didn't necessarily, that was the norm. I didn't necessarily see that I wasn't living the life of luxury that other people were living, or a settled home, or living in a nice house and a couple of cars for the family. But that was just our norm, and it was fine because my mum made a great deal of it, and my sisters were great as well. So, but then I look back now as the man that I am, and I think I know what it's like. I know what it's like.
Are you grateful for that period?
Absolutely, yeah. Like I said, any experience that I've been through, I don't think would allow me to be the person that I am today if I didn't go through them.
And do you think, you made reference to those injuries at Bournemouth gave you the chance to look back, and there's that old saying that life only makes sense when we view it backwards. What did you realise during that period of reflection that you'd taken, that you could take with you on the next stage of your journey?
I probably learned that, and this is something that I spoke on quite a lot. I probably learned that the obsession of putting everything in one basket is really dangerous mentally, and is a really dangerous place to be. Now I know that this is probably a bit of a generational thing as well, because we're afforded a little bit more space and time to be the people that we want to be as players. I don't think if you were, and I've said this before, if you're in Sir Alex Ferguson's dressing room when they won the treble, I don't think setting up a business would have been so actively encouraged, or doing things away from football would have been so actively encouraged. But when I got injured, I lost everything really, because I'd perceived getting to the Premier League as the place of happiness, and that was the destination of success, and that's where it finished. I was going to play in the Premier League and I would be happy. Now to have that taken away in such cruel fashion seemed like the end of the world, because I had nothing else. I had no other identity. I had no other things in my life that could bring me any form of contentment or fulfillment. Yep. So that's probably what taught me the biggest lesson.
How dark was that time?
Yeah, awful. I mean, for the first couple of months, I probably did nothing but drink. Now, if you think about what is most counterproductive to inflammation in the knee, alcohol was probably right up there. And it was an awful time. And I remember going to the manager at Bournemouth, and I think I broke down in the end, just in tears, and was like, I don't even know where these tears are coming from. I mean, I'm doing rehab, I'm here. Yeah, I don't feel great because I got injured, but surely there must be more to it than that. Because.
And what was the drinking doing for you?
Putting me to sleep. Yeah, it was taking me out of my reality, and my reality was that I'd lost all control, and I'd lost all control of my of where I wanted to go, and that was probably the most unstable in time of my life, because when I'm fit and I can push to get in the team, that's an element of that is in my control. But when I'm out of the team and I don't know if Bournemouth are going to stay up and don't know if I'm going to play in the Premier League again, they're all emotions and thoughts that are swirling through my head. I'm thinking, I can't control it, and I'm injured. I'm not going to be back for another 12 months. I don't know where Bournemouth are going to be. I don't know if I'm ever going to get the chance to play in the Premier League again. What about if I don't get back in the team in the Championship? My career is only going one way. So, yeah, it was awful. And but then, like I said, I learned so much throughout them times.
So who was the person you discovered once you got through that initial dark period? Who were you that you found at the other end of that analysis?
Great question. I mean, two completely different people, absolutely. I mean, going into the injury, and when I look back at what made me happy around the time of my injury, it was football. It was going out, it was girls, it was material objects. And when you feel so irrelevant in your day job, I guess I wasn't winning the big war, so I was winning little battles. I was buying a new car, I was buying jewelry, giving myself little pick-me-ups. And I guess when I started to go through the injury and go through the process of I guess unpicking the layers in my mind of what I was thinking and why I was thinking them and where they came from, I realised I'm not necessarily that person at all. I'm someone that, like you said, likes to help or give back, or I'm someone that likes to learn. I'm someone that likes to push the boundaries of what I can do. And that was an enlightening period, absolutely. It was a period of reflection. Now, the reflection wasn't so easy to do because I had to go to some quite dark places to get there. I had to speak about some traumas in my life that I didn't really want to speak about again. But listen, it uncovered things that I never knew about myself.
So you saw a psychologist, therapist?
Yeah, still speak to him now, yeah.
Really?
Yeah, we speak, and part of my pre-game routine is to speak to him. So we speak about, it's just a routine we do. It takes 3 or 4 minutes, and I'm sure you know all about it, but it puts me in a state of competitiveness.
So do you talk about football in that conversation, or
no?
We talk about how you're feeling?
Yeah, so we talk a little bit about settling down the inner child, any fears he may have in what I'm about to do, and then talking to the best version of myself and about what he looks like, how he stood, how he feels, how he competes, and then trying to distinguish which one you need right now, and then going out and playing.
I think this is a brilliant conversation to have, because I still think, even in 2020, in professional sport, not enough people, are doing what you're doing, which is seeking outside help and having these kinds of conversations. But even worse, I bet there are other professional sports people that are doing this, but they're not necessarily brave enough to admit that before they compete, they speak to a psychologist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels quite crass in many ways, Tyrone, to ask you this, but in terms of that period you went through and the reflection that you did, there's almost like a delicious irony that your career has taken off since that as well, while you've been liberated in so many other ways as a person. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's any coincidence that I kind of cleansed myself of the things I didn't like about myself. Listen, there's still bad habits that creep in from time to time, but the fact that I was able to go through that, and almost like you said, Jay, in terms of resetting and going again, setting new goals. I mean, the fact that I perceived the Premier League as success was bad enough and was dangerous enough, because quite rightly, if I got there, then what? So I had to go through a period of resetting my goals and really understanding that I had to enjoy the journey. I had to enjoy everything that I was about to go through, and not keep placing happiness at a far away moment in time or destination. So I guess when people say like, oh, when do you feel like you made it or anything like that, I don't think anybody would ever say that. And I think the journey is sometimes really hard to take in. I think our family and friends probably benefit from it more than what we do. Yeah. Because when I come back from playing for England, I've got a game for Villa 2 days later, and it's like you never get a chance to do what I did when I got injured, which was to reflect and which was to take stock of my life and appreciate where I come from.
And there will be so many people listening to this now who can relate to how you're feeling, not professional sports people, people in everyday life who find themselves defined by their job or chasing the dream that they can't wait for. And the problem is, when you reach that destination, you find out after 20 years of hard work, it's not quite as great as you thought it would be. And then what are you left with? So what are the tricks and the tools that you employ now to make sure you don't become the Tyrone Mings of 4 or 5 years ago, who is purely defined by success on a football field?
Well, I've got a lot of interests away from sport, and I find it, really tough to solely define myself as a footballer. So quite often when people say to me, oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, I play football. You get labelled as something. And having an identity away from that, I think, is so balancing for me, that I know that there's a bigger picture out there, and retirement will come one day. But what do I want to be when I retire? Who do I want to be? And working towards that now, I'm afforded the luxury of being able to set up businesses with fairly small injections of capital whilst playing football. I can build a small team around me who can do it. And I've set up 3 or 4 businesses in different industries, basically to learn about it. I feel like I learn from doing things. I learn this. I read great books, and I can learn through reading. But there's only so much that I can take in by not doing it myself. So I know that I enjoy business. I know that I enjoy the kind of administrative side of football, and the kind of executive side of football. But I also have a day job, so I balance not letting the things that I'm enjoying away from football, getting involved in football. I balance being involved in that and being a professional footballer. But as you can imagine, playing the Premier League and playing for England takes up a lot of physical but also mental time. But it allows me to distract from that. It allows me to, when I come off a football pitch, take the game in and see it for what it is. It's a game of football, and I play for England, and that is a game for my country, which is the greatest badge of honour you can wear. But then when I step into other areas of my life, those things are kind of redundant.
See, but to me, that is like just it's the same approach that you had when you went into Ipswich, that I see the parallels of. You'd come from being a mortgage broker, you had a sense of what life outside of the sport offered, so you went in and were almost liberated to just go and give it your best. And it sounds like you've returned to that state, just at a higher level with higher demands, but you're still getting that sense of perspective away from the game.
Yeah, it's probably a really good point. I mean, I often think that the more pressure I put on myself, quite often it affects my performance. And if my whole week is spent either worrying about the game we've just had or worrying about the game that's about to happen, I never leave any room in my head for any other positive thoughts or any other area of my life to succeed. So I can compartmentalize it a little bit, and I can see it with a little bit of perspective, I think.
What do you think some football players, some football managers, and quite a few football fans will respond with when they hear you talking about having interests outside of football? They will say, stick to football. Absolutely they will. And I've got no problem with that argument. I've got no problem with that perspective, because that argument only comes up when you're not playing well. Yeah.
When you're playing well, it's so great that you're
even when you're not playing well. Why is that the reason? Let's take Marcus Rashford, right? The perfect example at the moment.
Yeah.
Only doing good stuff. If he has a bad game for Man United, it must be the school dinners that's distracted him. Or, stick to football, Marcus. It's used the phrase howling at the moon. It's outdated werewolves howling at the moon, stick to football, because they don't understand that you can be a better, more rounded, more considered professional athlete if you have an interior design company, or if you have a charity that you've set up, or if you're campaigning for a more equal society. Why can't the two be mutually beneficial? How can we change this mindset? It does my head in every time I see a footballer told to stick to football, I think. You know what I mean?
I know, yeah. But what people have to understand is they're talking to young men. They're talking to young men that ultimately have to step away from football one day. If you tell that person to stick to football for the next... Marcus Rashford's a little bit younger than me, but let's say that I've got 8 years left of playing football and I've played for 7 already. So if you tell someone to stick to one thing for 15 years, you're not getting a very balanced or well-rounded human that comes out the other end. And I think that's a society that we need to get away from. That's a mindset we need to get away from.
But why can't we be impressed by it? Why can't we go, wow, Tyrone Mings plays for England, plays in the Premier League, and has time for all this other stuff as well?
But there's something around it that it's an either-or mentality, isn't it? Either you're a footballer or you're a business person. And that conversation, what you're saying is, but I can be both and. I can be both a footballer and somebody that has a variety of interests. But that dual thinking isn't necessarily what sells newspapers, the subtlety, the nuance of it.
Do you pay any attention to it if you get a social media post telling you to stick to football?
No. I mean, quite often I get comments like that when I'm speaking on diversity or racism. Oh, he's talking about this again. Why don't you just stick to football?
Oh, really?
Yeah. It's not necessarily about the business.
Because winning a game of football is so much more important than having a diverse, equal society, is it?
Yeah, exactly. So I take it with a pinch of salt, of course. It doesn't affect me to the level where I'm scrolling through tweets and looking for comments, because I think if you go looking for them, of course you'll find things that you don't want to see.
How are you with external criticism?
Fine, absolutely fine, and I think some of it is unfair, some of it is fair, and we are playing right at the top in terms of our sport to be able to deal with stuff like that, and we have to find a way to deal with stuff like that. But that's not saying it's easy, and everybody deals with it differently. You either don't read it, or you can read it and you can park it, or it affects you and you have to perhaps sometimes get some help. No way is better or worse. But I think what sometimes people forget is we're still humans, and we have to sometimes be aware of the things that you're writing and how it may affect a human, not a footballer, a human who is behind the badge or the shirt or behind the social media profile.
So who do you listen to? As a human, when they say to you, Tyrone, you could do that better, or Tyrone, you wouldn't consider this. Who does make you sit up and pay attention?
I think anybody that has access to me personally, I would take advice from. Now, there's going to be a lot of, even in the punditry world, there's a lot of opinions on what you should or shouldn't have done in a game, and they are exactly what they're classed as, opinions. And if someone genuinely wants to help me or genuinely has my best interest at heart, I think they will reach out, or I'll be speaking to them already anyway, and we'll be developing that relationship about, like John Terry at Villa, for example, one of the best Premier League defenders to ever play. Of course, I listen to him, and we spend a lot of time going through clips and stuff. So social media, there's a lot of opinions, and a lot of it these days is clickbait and stuff. So there's a lot of, take that with a pinch of salt. But yeah, anybody that has a personal line into me or genuinely wants to improve my performance or my thinking, I think there are times when you should listen and you should take notice.
So I read a lovely quote from you when you were talking about business, and you were saying that you don't fall in love with an idea, but you fall in love with a person and their values. So what would it take for somebody to get into your inner circle to then have an influence? What kind of values do you look for then?
Trust, of course, in the world that we live in. And I say that as someone who's been in the football world for long enough now to know that there are not always trustworthy people or honest people in it. So trust and honesty is two things that if you can find in sport, if you can find in a manager or an agent or a colleague, they are so valuable. But trust takes a long time to develop, and honesty is something that you can give. And honesty doesn't always mean people telling you what you want to hear. Honesty is developed by, and trust is developed by people sometimes telling you what you don't want to hear. But you have to be big enough and brave enough and thick-skinned enough to see through what they're actually saying and why they're saying it. So if you're trustworthy and you're honest, that starts the relationship, and that starts things off on a good foot.
And do you think you started to develop those characteristics again after that period of retrospection that you went through at Bournemouth? Absolutely,
yeah. If you had asked me what characteristics I look for in a person at that time, I don't know what I would have said. But the younger me would have probably been a lot more elaborate and wanted things that were all singing and all dancing, and paid a lot of attention to social media, and wanted to be perceived to be a really fun person and someone in the dressing room that people could go out drinking with, and all of those things that come with being a young player. I think you also, as part of being a human away from being a footballer, you have to go through those things. You absolutely have to enjoy yourself. The difficulty comes is when you let that affect what is ultimately your day job, and that's a position where none of us as players or anybody in any walk of life should let the two affect each other.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing that injury at Bournemouth had such an impact on your psychological state today, but I am interested why it had such a big impact, because you'd imagine getting released as a 17-year-old or whatever, just as you're on the cusp of success, might have been more than you could handle, or even living in the homeless shelter as a kid might have been more than you could handle. But you dealt with those kinds of things, and getting thrust into the first team at Ipswich, having been a mortgage advisor 5 days before, you dealt with that okay. Why was this injury at Bournemouth such a big thing?
I think, like I said, because I had placed all of my future happiness on the Premier League is where I'm going to find my happiness.
So was it because that was the move that got you into the Premier League, and you were a few minutes into the debut? So because you were, weren't you? It was your Premier League
6
debut.
minutes, yeah.
So you were 6 minutes into the thing that you had pinned basically your whole life on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All of my football career had been
It was about
around
that moment.
Yeah, was about playing in the Premier League. Of course, it was the highest level that we can compete at domestically, and imagine finally getting there after all the adversities that you'd said. Finally getting there, and your family are there, and I was Bournemouth's record signing. So the positive media that came with that. This was it. This was my time to shine. This was when I was about to go and be the happiest I'd ever been. And like you said, that was Bournemouth's first season in the Premier League. So I didn't know if they were even going to stay up. I mean, Max Gradle done his ACL in the same game as me, who was another big signing. Callum Wilson done it 6 weeks later. So all of a sudden, everything's stacked against us, and we're all of a sudden favourites for relegation. If we do get relegated, has my dream gone? That's why it was so bad.
Isn't that a great lesson for people listening to this who might be going through a difficult time at the moment, that what feels like the single worst moment of your life, years later you reflect on as being something that now gives you such clarity of thought?
And it's difficult because when you're in that, there's not much you can say to someone to try and give them some perspective that later on in life this might be great. Because when you're going through it, yeah, right, but it might be great, but it might also never end. So there's not much that you can say to someone in that situation. But I found that when you realise that you are in control and you can only control what is happening now, it's such a more stable place to be. And you can't control what's happening in the future. You can't really affect what's happened in the past. So I had to take responsibility of the decisions that I was making there and then. And listen, drinking, staying up late, going out wasn't benefiting me. Because ultimately I had to place a little bit of hope that Bournemouth stayed in the Premier League. But I had to make sure that when Bournemouth staying in the Premier League and me getting fit again met, I was ready for that opportunity. I couldn't do that if I was continuing what I was doing.
So when you made your England debut, like that's a culmination of a different dream altogether. How did you approach that differently than that dream of getting to the Premier League?
I think that was probably more one that I could take in my stride, because I'd only really probably been thinking about playing for England when I signed for Aston Villa. I mean, at Bournemouth, as a player that's sitting on the bench, there's no good thinking about, one day I want to play for England, because whilst that might happen, I need to get into the team first. Yeah. So I had a period of 6 months at Aston Villa in the Championship. Then I went into the Premier League season thinking, right, this season I want to break into the England squad. It only happened to be that the first England squad that was announced, I was in. So I didn't really have time to be disappointed about being left out of a squad when I thought I should have been in it, and then have to go again, right, park that disappointment. I try and get into the October squad. It was like I'd been thrust into the England spotlight in September after playing 4 games in the Premier League or something. So that was something I felt I could take more in my stride. Right. Because I knew that I was prepared. I knew that I was playing well. I knew that I could go in and hold my own, but that doesn't mean to say that it wasn't daunting going in there. But I also know, and I remind myself of this when I'm playing Belgium, for example, the other day, I'm not going to face anything on this football pitch that I haven't faced in the Premier League. I'm not going to face any tougher player than what we play against regularly. And I must be doing something well in the Premier League and acquitting myself well to get into the England squad. So I guess that's probably an easier one to take than first setting foot in the Premier League.
But then you did face something on the pitch on your England debut that you don't face in the Premier League every week, thankfully, which was the most horrendous racist abuse. And I can only imagine that you as a team were this close to walking off the football field. In hindsight, do you wish you had walked off the field? Or are you pleased that you stayed on as a team and made that decision?
No, I think if we had walked off the pitch, I mean, there would be a lot of people that say we should have, because it would have been a bigger statement. I completely understand that argument. But at the same time, we let the relevant authorities do what they needed to do. And there was a certain protocol that we had to follow to allow them post-game to do that. Now, if we walked off the pitch and they had to sanction us, maybe would have taken the spotlight away from what we were actually walking off the pitch for. So no, I think the dialogue we had before the game between the FA and the manager and the team on briefing us about what may happen was really clear and allowed us to know, if this does happen, what you should do. Shouting at the linesman wasn't in the protocol, but that got picked up.
That in itself, you shouting at him, do you hear that? That in itself became a powerful moment.
Yeah, and I'm glad it did, because, listen, like you said, I don't know how long into my debut that was, but I heard it before the warm-up even started. The warm-up started, me and Callum Wilson were jogging across the pitch, come out of the tunnel, jogged across the pitch. Even as we got to the other end of the pitch, we heard it then. We're thinking, surely that wasn't what we thought it was. But yeah, going back to my original point, we were briefed so well on what we should do that when it happened, I think it was powerful that we stuck to it in the most awful circumstances. We were able to think with clarity when we're being racially abused. I mean, that is powerful in itself.
I don't want to have this conversation and make out that racism is a Bulgarian issue.
Absolutely, yeah.
Not an English issue. We might only have another 15, 20 minutes to sit here and talk. So I don't really want to float around the edges on this. I really want to understand from you, how big remains the issue in this country? What do we need to be doing more of? What do you want to see happen in this country in the next 12 or 18 months? What is life like from the perspective of a black man in Britain in 2020?
Well, first of all, I think we have to appreciate how far we've come. I mean, you talk about us living in difficult situations and the things we're arguing or demonstrating for, campaigning for now, started hundreds of years ago. And we have to really appreciate the people that come before us and lived in much tougher times than what we did, to allow us to even have the voice to now campaign and to have the voice to walk out into the street and not feel like you're going to be imprisoned for looking at a police officer the wrong way. So I feel really fortunate that we are living in times that we didn't have to live in, that my parents had to endure or my grandparents had to endure. But that doesn't mean that we should be grateful just because things aren't that bad. We shouldn't just have to be grateful because we've made a bit of progress. Yeah. And I think a lot of terms that were bandied about in the Black Lives Matter campaigning and the George Floyd stuff, was the things that came out of it were kind of systemic racism and stuff like that. I don't think that's the world we're living in. I think what we're living in is kind of unconscious bias, and people that have never had to change, people that have never had to recruit from more diverse pools. And if you've never had to do that, quite rightly so, you probably don't know much about it. You probably don't know much about the cultures of different people. And I would say that we are also probably guilty, and I'm saying we as in male footballers, guilty of not understanding different elements of our own game. For example, the women's game and women working in sport, we don't understand quite how much abuse they probably get. And that's because we've never experienced it. So when I'm sitting here talking about racism and trying to build more diverse structures in football, it's about educating people. It's about them understanding how powerful diversity can be, and them empathizing also with the lack of opportunities that black people have had historically in the game. So I think, yeah, we're all guilty of it. We're all guilty, whether it be on racism or discrimination or just oversight or negligence. I think we're all guilty of it to a certain extent. It just happens to be that I'm a black man, and I've lived in times where I've been racially abused, and I can see that certain pathways would have been maybe blocked or not as easy to come by for people like myself.
What kind of messages or teachings did your parents pass on to you, Tyrone, about when you were racially abused? How did they teach you to process it and to respond to it?
Well, obviously they were very emotional at the time and around the England stuff, but I have a white mum and a black dad, so obviously I had the best of both. And I mean, my dad growing up was quite balanced in his views and quite calm. So when it came to me being racially abused, I think they probably leaned on me for a little bit of wisdom more than me going to them, because whilst my dad would have experienced awful things in his childhood, things weren't as progressive or weren't as acceptable these days as they were back then. When I say he was calm and collected, he's calm and collected now. Going through what he went through growing up, he was probably quite aggressive and wanted to change things physically, whereas my mum is very much more, I'm her son, I'm her only son, she loves me to bits, so she gives me that kind of balance. So I have to find a middle ground between not being too loving, not being too physical. So I find, and I read quite a lot on kind of the non-violence protests that have happened over the years as well, and how powerful they've been. Yeah. So I lean on, I guess, different areas of how to come through things and what is the best course of action to take. Listen, you can't dive into a stadium full of fans and start fighting people that are racially abusing you. So you have to try and go around the problem and realize that, okay, the problem is here, but how can we tackle that from a higher level? How can we be wiser or smarter than the people that we're kind of fighting against.
When you talk about it being more of an unconscious bias rather than clear and overt racism in this country, that almost makes it a more difficult enemy to fight, doesn't it? So what do you want to see happen? What should we all be doing to fight this unconscious bias, or not necessarily to fight it, to educate people about it?
That's exactly what I think it is, education. And I think we all have a responsibility, regardless of colour, to understand the challenges that our colleagues, friends, family may be going through. And I think that's probably where we've fallen short historically, is just going about our own life, and probably not paying attention enough, and probably not having enough empathy to people in worse situations than ourselves. So what I would like to happen, of course, the diversity code has come in, which I've been fortunate enough to be involved with. That will hopefully create some more diverse organisations, but it's not necessarily that. It's about creating equal opportunity, not just placing black people in power, in positions of power. We don't want that. We want people that are well qualified. We want people with the right intentions. We want people with the right morals. So what I would like to happen, absolutely, is people to educate themselves. I'm not talking about diving through and combing through books for hours on end, but probably just understanding why there isn't diverse organizations or corporations or associations involved in sport. Like, everybody at a high level seems to be white, and that's the world that we're living in, and that isn't a fair reflection of society or of the participants of that sport.
But whilst you're talking about some really powerful rules that can start to shift that narrative, I think there's a softer skill there at the heart of what you're talking about, which is about empathy, emotional intelligence, listening to others and engaging with them. And they're all skills that you're telling us have been critical in your journey to high performance. So how can people develop that? So people that might be listening to it that go, I'm not sure I am as emotionally switched on as I could be. How have you learned to develop those skills?
Speaking to people a lot wiser than myself. Ironically, listening to podcasts like this, I think when you listen to things that perhaps are thought provoking, it makes you, it kind of triggers something in yourself to think, oh, maybe I don't do that, or maybe I could do that better. So probably broadening your horizons in terms of what you know and the people you surround yourself with, because people will challenge you day to day if you surround yourself with the right people. But also there has to be a want. There has to be a want for people to change, and also not trying to drive the message so much that people switch off. I mean, you have to be soft, like you said, around the subjects that we're talking about. But honestly, the way that I've learned is to try things, and to fail ultimately. Try things, fail, learn from your failures, and repeat it. And that never stops. Unfortunately, that never stops. You're always trying and you're always failing.
So what would you say has been the biggest failure that's led to the biggest breakthrough for you?
My mindset, definitely. My mindset of one, placing all my eggs in one basket, but two, perceiving happiness as something or a destination that never really exists. We're talking about, I should be right now the happiest. If we're talking about how I've seen happiness and success, I should be the happiest, most content, most fulfilled person ever to walk this planet. But I still have down days. I still have periods in a day where I don't feel so great. I still have periods in a week where I don't feel so great. So whilst I'm sitting there and saying I've got all the answers, I absolutely don't. So my biggest failure has absolutely been having the wrong mindset, and the mindset probably where I thought at 22 that I knew everything and that I'd cracked it. I'd signed for a professional club, and then I signed for a Premier League club. Nobody can tell me anything. Everything that I seem to be doing seems to be working.
See, we had a really interesting conversation with Johnny Wilkinson on this podcast where he spoke about understanding that nothing in his life is more important than anything else. So he used quite a stark example, which is that winning the Rugby World Cup was no more important than doing the washing up. Because all you, I know, it's a hard one to get your head around, but basically he explained it as you're using your body to achieve a goal. If you're playing rugby, you're using body to achieve the goal of winning the World Cup. If you're doing the washing up, you're using your body to achieve the goal of cleaning the plate. So have you managed to get yourself into a mindset where being with friends and family in a really good setting or working with your interior design business is as fulfilling as playing for your country, playing for Aston Villa? Nothing is ahead of anything else, if you like.
Absolutely. I think that's a really important message, that you can genuinely only control the present also. You can only control what you're about to do. So like, I think Eddie Howe at Bournemouth used to say that the next game you play in is the most important of your career. It's the only one you can control. It's not that any is significant than another.
So when you've played for England, how long are you letting yourself get high on that supply? And how quick are you moving on to the next thing?
Probably until I get home.
Really?
Yeah, generally until you get home, because there's always something else. And the period between the game and getting home, you can revel in glory or wallow in your sorrows if you've lost. But I guess until you get home, things reset. And I think what you're speaking about in terms of nothing's more important, I think everything in your life plays a different role also. So the feeling I get from being with friends and family and sitting around listening to music is giving you an element of it touches your soul, really, doesn't it? That's giving you soul fulfillment. The football side, I guess, is a little bit more egotistical. It's I'm a professional footballer and people look at me to perform, and when I do my job well, I get plaudits and I get benefits that come with that. That's more nourishing and massaging that part. But the stuff that you do away from football, I think, is no less or no more important, because it adds to a more well-rounded person.
And the old Tyrone, where he would have gone out, chatted up some girls, told them I played for England a few days ago, bought himself a car to congratulate himself, gone and got some nice gear because he's now an England international. But that probably would have been a few years ago if you'd have played for England at that time, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hate to think, genuinely, I hate to think what would have happened if I was in a situation where I played for England. I look at some young lads coming through now, Mason Greenwood, Phil Foden's, they're Jude Bellingham. They're 17, 18, 19. That's not a problem that I would have liked to have at that age.
Would you have coped?
I don't know. I would like to think that I would have found a way, but genuinely, if I sit here now and think about the person that I was, I probably would have made just as many mistakes as what these young lads are making. And that's sometimes what we don't perhaps see, is they are young men. And if we look at what we were doing at 17, 18, 19, would you have coped? Who knows?
See, that fascinates me, Tyrone, against your background, because I wonder what messages would you give to these kids that have come through an academy system. They've never really had the setback or the failure of being let go. You know, they've always been told they were the next big thing. They get the rewards, that their world is comfortable, that everything they do is rewarded. What kind of messages would you say to them that you feel could help them?
Like I said, I think the greatest thing that I learned, and if I was in this situation again and someone could tell me this and I could take it in, because it's probably not an easy thing to take in, is that we are always responsible for what happens and we can always control it. So if you're released at 17, 18 and you're blaming the club, or you're blaming another player that was playing ahead of you that you don't think was better than you, you have to understand that for some reason, someone else didn't see that. And you have to figure out, first of all, why. And if you want to continue in the journey of football, you have to figure out what you need to do different and how you need to position yourself again to get back in front of those people that are making decisions. But ultimately, you are in control and you are responsible for anything good and anything bad that happens. So whilst that is a good position to be in when things are going well, it's also a comforting place to be when things aren't going well, because you know that you can control it, and you know that ultimately if I do this, a kind of cause and effect, if I do this, this will happen. When that's taken away from me is when I find it toughest. So like being injured, but then you have to reset and realize, okay, I'm injured, but I'm still in control. I'm still responsible for the outcome of this knee injury. And luckily I found that out early enough, and my knee has never caused me any problems again. But that's a process, and that's an understanding, and that's a learning within yourself and within your mind that whether you're released at 17 or 16, or whether you're released from a club when you're coming to the end of your contract, you're always in control. And I think that is such a powerful place to be.
Yeah, and it's such a good message for people, because I think people are often scared of taking what we talk about on this pod, 100% responsibility. It's so much easier to attach blame to someone else or to find fault with a certain thing that happened. But actually the reality is taking 100% responsibility isn't scary when you do it. It's just massively empowering, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Taking it all on yourself.
I guess the fear should come from not being in control. The fear should be, so you're telling me that if I work really hard, I'm still not going to get an opportunity? That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, we don't know what's going to happen, but we do know that you can control the process, and you can control the journey, and you can control, to a certain extent, what happens.
But I think you can control all of it. That doesn't mean it'll all go the way you want it to go.
Yeah.
But as soon as you start looking for luck or blame in any capacity, then you're giving up control. And as soon as you give up control, you can't get what you want.
What I mean is, in football, it's an opinion-based game, isn't it? So you can't please everybody. You can't always make a manager pick you.
Yep.
But you can take responsibility for trying to improve. You can take responsibility for trying to be a better person.
And accept responsibility if you're not picked. Don't blame the manager for not picking you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you talk about the rounded Tyrone that is with your family listening to music, or you're going into the St George's Park dining room with all those other England players, who do you want them to see? What are the characteristics that you say, this is me, laid bare?
I think what people say is always a little bit different. And I'm hoping what they mean by that is that I probably speak quite well, and have seen quite a lot, so I can speak on a lot of different topics. But in terms of things that are important to me, or a perception of what I would want people to have of me, I think empathy sits quite high on that list. And that is probably because, and we spoke about it already, I've seen what it's like to need a helping hand. And I think this isn't a criticism of other players, but I think sometimes they haven't. Not saying they haven't come from hardships, because there's people that have come from a lot tougher backgrounds than I have. But there's people that have come up through the academy system, and ever since their kind of adolescence or young or teenage years, they've known nothing but the professional game, and then they've come through and they've taken the path that is sign a professional contract, make your debut, earn quite good sums of money when you're young. And I'm not saying that doesn't come with its own pressures as well, but in terms of, like I said, me being well-rounded, I would hope that people look at me and think, throughout all of that, he still managed to not only compete at a high level, but get himself back to a high level, but retain that element of humility that I can relate to my former self. I can relate to who I was as a kid and what me and my family went through as a kid, and I can hopefully use my platform now and what I have now to give back and to try and help people in similar situations, much like what Marcus is doing.
And finally, do you feel that you're in a period where footballers have actually realised they are more than just people that kick a ball and have a night out? Whether it is you coming on this podcast and talking about mental health struggles, talking to a psychologist, dealing with racist abuse, whether it's Marcus feeding kids who otherwise wouldn't be fed, whether it's Raheem a couple of seasons ago clearly calling out the British press for being racist. It feels to me like you are all aware that you can be so much more than just footballers, and you're maybe lifting each other up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes slightly with the times, because you can't ram down people's throats a message that won't be accepted. For example, like I said, if we played in 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and it wasn't so accepted to be doing things like that, you have to be careful about what message you're delivering to people. And also, they couldn't control the narrative back then. Everything that they wanted to say had to go through the media or through interviews. we can speak on topics on social media and kind of control our narrative, come on things like this and control what we want to say, and have more of a authentic message that we're trying to deliver. And I think that's a really powerful place to be. And I think hopefully it continues to go in that way, where players feel more liberated, that they can go and be themselves and they can go and explore interests away from football. But what we also have to understand is you can't let that affect football. Because if you really want to get to the top and if you really want to compete at the top, you have to pay so much attention to what you're doing and so much attention to what your thoughts are and how you're spending your time away from football. I mean, we only get judged on 90 minutes of a week, but how many minutes are there that go into the other areas of our life? We have to be careful that we're not sacrificing what's going to happen in that 90 minutes by our other interests. But no, I think we're living in a time where hopefully people will feel liberated to go and explore those things.
Brilliant. I can't thank you enough for coming on this podcast.
That's right, thank you.
I think it's such an important conversation because, you know, you sit here as a handsome millionaire, professional footballer, playing for his country, and there will be people listening to this going, well, he must be secure, 100% happy, he's achieved it, he's done it. If I was where he is, I would be happy.
I'd be happy, yeah.
Yet you are a reminder to all of those people that whether you're you or whether you're them, we're all on a constant journey towards happiness. We're all constantly exploring what's next. And I think, you know, the one thing I would say to you is, if ever you see those words, stick to football. Do the total opposite and stick to everything else as well as football. Don't just stick to it, because, you know, you've got a lot to say and a lot to offer. So thank you so much for coming on here and having the kind of conversation that professional footballers need to be having.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was
No,
perfect.
thank you very much.
Interesting episode, hey? And of course, there's so much more from the High Performance Podcast as well. Please hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, give us a thumbs up, leave a review, but somehow get involved with the High Performance Podcast and become part of our growing community. Thanks for being part of the adventure.